Vicki and I aren't sure what we're doing up here for a moment. So we heard such powerful testimonies over the last couple days. And honestly, I'm not sure there's anything I can say more than what we have already heard, including what we heard this morning. And perhaps you've heard quite enough from Vicki and I. But I think we were each asked to give a testimony. And so the story I want to tell you this morning before I ask Vicki to do the same is really about how I rediscovered a personal relationship with Christ. And that story, which I'll try and keep brief, but it actually began in some ways not so very far from here. It began at Willow Creek, for those of you who know Willow Creek. Bill Hybels, the pastor there, who I had not known before, but he had read my book, Tough Choices, and used it as a management and leadership training guide for his team, and he called and asked whether I would come and speak to the summit, the leadership summit. And so I did. I was a little bit nervous about that because it wasn't exactly the venue I was used to. I had been charging hard in the corporate world for quite a long time. And so I didn't usually speak in that kind of setting, and it's a big setting. But I agreed, and we were gathered in his office ahead of this interview, which is what it was going to be, and he asked if I would pray with him, and while I was a little surprised, I shouldn't have been in retrospect, but I was, I agreed. And at the end of our interview, 30 minutes or so later, Bill led me to the front of the stage. I've been told he had not done this before, and we stood together in front of all the people that were there and all the people that were connected via video, and he asked everyone to pray for me and my husband Frank and our family and for my journey. And I bowed my head and listened and was really overcome by gratitude for the caring of so many people who didn't know me. And then, honestly, came a feeling that I was being elevated, lifted up. It was a sensation so strong that it was almost physical, and it truly took me aback. And that feeling of being lifted up was followed by a sensation of deep peace. When I was a child and into young adulthood, I believed in a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. But as I grew older, and perhaps because I was more and more engaged in all the complexities of life and a career, my faith became more abstract, I would say. I still prayed every day. I still knew that our souls didn't die, that this wasn't the end. I had faith that good would triumph over evil and that we do reap what we sow. But I honestly had come to view God as something like a super CEO of a big enterprise. He had created the universe. He had put in place quite a sophisticated set of management processes, and those processes kept things running, not necessarily smoothly every day, but basically in the direction that he intended over the long arc of time. He didn't attend to every detail. He didn't know every person. I mean, how could he possibly? But he did somehow receive regular management reports that directed his attention to the strategic issues that required his attention or his intervention. And as I, had this sort of CEO model of God, sounds a little self-centered, don't you think? But as I had this vision, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the divinity of Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit. These were all, of course, very powerful allegories that drew people toward the right idea. They were profound ideas at the heart of a sophisticated governance system, but I wasn't really sure they were real anymore. Bill and I talked about all that over the course of a year, and he was constantly prodding me to think about all of this. I was sort of surprised by his personal interest in me. He was very persistent, and it was his persistence, his personal interest that kept me pondering the contours of my faith. Why had I lost this sense? Why did I think this? And so my doubts grew, and one Christmas Eve, I asked God for help in resolving my doubts. And I prayed for a sign. And the next morning on Christmas, I woke up with a clear mind, because it suddenly became blindingly obvious to me that there were signs all around me. And so many of those signs came from the world of science and technology, where I had made my professional career. I thought that morning about the scientists who are discovering the miracle of millions of new forms of life in the depths of the ocean, some in places so dark and inhospitable that no one had ever imagined life could survive there, much less thrive. Why not, then, the miracle of an Immaculate Conception? Were there not inexplicable mysteries that confronted us every single day? Were physicists not still struggling to understand the basic building blocks of the universe? Were quarks and protons and dark matter not profoundly miraculous? Did Einstein not prove that energy never dies, it just changes form? And of course God knew every single one of us personally and kept track of us and heard our prayers. Every time I turn on the GPS in my car, I marvel at the human ingenuity that built a system of technologies that keeps track, precise track, of where we are, knows when we deviate off course, and provides precise instructions as to how to return to the right path. We may ignore those instructions. At the next available opportunity, make a legal U-turn. We may even become annoyed by those instructions, but nevertheless, guidance is provided. If human beings can do this, then certainly God knows everything that is happening in the universe, not in broad management strokes, but in minute, personal detail. And because God knows us so well, his care was instantiated in a physical, empathetic son, not because God needed him, but because we did. And Jesus Christ shows us the right path. A short time later, my father died, and I grieved deeply, but I felt none of the awful months of turmoil that had accompanied my mother's death. And despite my tears and my tearfully delivered eulogy when the congregation sang Amazing Grace, I felt only sweet peace. I would come to understand the depth of God's personal love in a year filled with fear and pain. In the February of 2009, my clearly shaken doctor informed me that I had an unidentified form of cancer and that tests needed to begin immediately. After being diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer, I battled my way through 11 rounds of surgery, 4 months of chemotherapy, and 2.5 months of radiation. And yet, through all of that, this sweet peace never left me. For those of you who've read my book, you know there are lots of things I have been afraid of in the course of my life. And one of the things I have been afraid of since I was a little girl was dying. And now, faced with the very real possibility of death in that year, I was not afraid. Never once. I realized when I was cured that cancer had brought blessings, the love of family, the nurture of friendship, the kindness of so many strangers, the joy of life, the power of faith. These are things I came to appreciate in a new and profound way. And I came to see, yes, even cancer as a gift from God. My ordeal with cancer, though, paled in comparison to our younger daughter's battles with her own demons. She suffered from addiction. And a couple of weeks after I finished my radiation treatments, we were told that Lori, our beloved Lori, had died alone in her apartment. The grief and the guilt my husband and I felt were almost suffocating. And yet, at her funeral, people told me that she was in a better place. And for the first time in my life, I knew what they meant, and I accepted it as real. I was certain that she had not been truly alone in her final moments and that we were not alone in our sorrow, and so I was comforted. Soon after that, my husband told me that he had lost his faith. He had always been a faithful man, but he could not believe that Jesus loved him and that God could let such a terrible thing happen. And so I prayed that Frank would be given a sign and his faith restored. At a certain point in this process, I was at the wall in Israel, and my prayer was that Frank would find his faith. A few days before Father's Day, he was in the garage. My husband loves cars. He loves to tinker. He was changing the oil for the gazillionth time in one of his cars. And he returned to the house with a look of relief on his face. He had been working and had seen over in the corner of the garage a pile of boxes, which had been sitting in that corner of the garage for years. And for no particular reason, he decided to open one of them. Lying on top were 4 Father's Day cards from Lori. And in one of those cards was a long letter that she had written to him many years ago, telling him what a fine father he was and how much she loved him. And he read, "I love you," in her childish hand. And at that moment, he knew that Jesus loved him and that Lori had found peace. And I knew that God hears our prayers and answers those he should. It is the nature of life to ebb and flow, and life is flowing now. I am engaged in things that I love and that challenge me, and this is one of them. I am unburdened, totally unburdened by fear. And I realize in a way I have not before that life is not measured in time. It is measured in love and contribution and moments of grace. The very last line in my book is that my soul is at peace. And perhaps when I wrote that sentence, which was in 2005, I didn't fully understand what it meant, but I do now. The peace of the Lord passeth all understanding. It lifts us up. It guides us on our way. It comforts us in our time of sorrow. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Amen. Thank you so very much for being here, for letting us share. Thank you. And we are doing something very special together. Those of you who have been associated with Opportunity for a long time have known it for a long time. Those of us who have been with Opportunity for a shorter time see it and feel it as well. We see it and feel it and are touched by the grace of some of the clients that you saw here. We see it and feel it and touch it in the community of family that we experience in this room over the last couple days. Please know that your incredible global CEO, and we are so blessed to have her, but please know that she and all of the management team at Opportunity, and I and all of your board members, we feel a great sense of both opportunity and obligation to be wise stewards of your generosity, wise stewards of the assets of our clients. And we know that what we are doing is pleasing to God, because what we are enabling is for everyone who is gifted by God to find their gifts and raise them to the glory of God. Thank you so very much.
Well, good morning. Ray, I want to ask you one question. Are you from Arkansas? Tennessee. I've never heard anybody in my life that sounded more like Bill Clinton, and this is not a political statement. This is simply a statement of, I was hearing that twang, and I thought, oh my heavens, that sounds like Bill Clinton. Yeah, it was very charming. Being a Southerner, I found it very, very charming. So, my testimony begins in a small town outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And as I listened to Remy and Amina talk last night, about their lives and some of the things that they went through, it hit a chord with me that will always hit a chord with me every day for the rest of my life. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that I know what it feels like to live in the kind of poverty that they lived in the Philippines. But I will tell you, I did grow up in poverty. And it wasn't an intentional thing. It was circumstances that were beyond my family's control, primarily the result of an illness that my mother went through as a young child, growing up in the 50s. Depression was not something that was understood or accepted. And so she struggled. And in that struggle, my dad struggled. And in that struggle, my brother and I struggled. And the struggle included things like not knowing if you would have a meal to eat during the day, not knowing if you would have someone at home when you got back from school in the afternoon, not knowing if you would have clean clothes to wear to school the next morning. And so I share all those things with you. Every time I talk about this, it makes my heart beat at such a fast pace because it's raw. And it will always be a raw thing for me. And it has drawn me to where I am today. And I will share that with you as well. I know what it feels like not to fit in, not to feel like you are worthy, to feel like you're trapped, and to wonder, as we heard Amina say last night, is there a way out of this? But through the good fortune of my extended family, most especially my grandmother, and my church, they came to our family, came to my father, and offered help to us. And so I would say and offer to you all at about age 12, things began to turn around. My dad was working. It's just all of the money that he was earning was going towards trying to find a solution to help my mother. So at age 12, I joined a wonderful Southern Baptist church, a big church in Decatur, Georgia, Forest Hills Baptist Church. And all of a sudden, I had this extended 3,000 member family. And I share that with you because I accepted Christ as my Savior at 12 and laughingly say I went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. I mean, I was in church as much as anybody could be in church, as most Southern Baptists are. And so from ages 12 through 20, I had a very rich life that was involved around my church. But those feelings of not being worthy or good enough or accomplished enough were always in the back of my head. And so I saw an opportunity to get out of that life that I had lived. And my very best friend through high school and I applied to go in the Peace Corps. And then she said, well, we had worked through college and through loans by a couple of families to get us through. And she said, well, I had, she had not, but she said, you know, there's this great job awaiting for us to be a flight attendant with Delta Airlines. And I think this sounds like a lot of fun. Why don't we travel the world and kind of take it easy for a while? So it sounded like a good thing to me, right? So I thought, I'll do this for a year, and then I'll go back and answer my life's calling to serve the world or serve people of the world. I'll accelerate this conversation because so a week before I was to leave, the CEO of the company was on a flight with me and introduced himself. And he said, tell me a little bit about yourself. And so I told him a little bit. And then I said, you know, but this is my last trip because I'm going to go do something really meaningful with my life. So you can imagine what he thought well, what are you doing here? I think this is pretty meaningful. Delta Airlines is a great company. You know, it's not shabby, especially for a girl from Decatur, Georgia. At any rate, but he didn't say that. He laughed and he said, I want you to come by my office next week, and I want to show you 3 or 4 jobs. And maybe one of those will be appealing to you. Anyhow, I thought, the CEO of Delta Airlines, me? Really? Are you kidding? But I called his office, and I went by, and he sat down with me and spent an hour talking about these various jobs. And he said, I'm not going to give you these jobs. You're going to interview for yourself. I interviewed, was accepted in a job in marketing and research, and that was the beginning of close to a 30-year career at Delta Airlines. And many of you know I moved from being a flight attendant to being in charge of all the operations of the company over the course of time, except for pilots. And then a week before 9/11, was promoted into a role as Chief Marketing Officer and planning, where we put all of our airplanes, both from a profitability perspective, schedule pricing, and all that stuff. So I went from thinking I had the best job in the world to thinking, dear God, what have you done to me? Because that was a year like no other year in my life. And that is actually when I would offer to you that Christ was beginning to get through into this stubborn head of mine, that there was another life for me outside of the one I'd been living, which had not been bad. It just hadn't been focused on His kingdom and His calling. And I had a wonderful friend who was the Monsignor of Christ the King Catholic Church in Atlanta. And I had been meeting with him regularly to convert to the Catholic Church because my kids were being raised Catholic, because my husband was Catholic and I wanted us to worship together. So I could talk to you about Southern Baptist, Catholic, and Presbyterians. Come and talk to me if you want to talk about various religions. I can talk about all of them. But the wonderful thing is I had tried for so many years to convert to Catholicism, and I'd get about halfway through catechism, and I would, for whatever reason, not make it because we had some emergency in the airline industry. Long story short, Father Kenny said, tell me a little bit about what you know about the Bible. So I said, well, you know, as a young girl, I read the Bible cover to cover, and I know a little bit about it. And so he said, well, I want you to come by my office, here again, another office, and let me see what you know about the Bible, and we'll make a decision around how you join the church. And I remember thinking, here's the Monsignor of the largest Catholic church in the city of Atlanta. So I visited with him for about 8 weeks. We didn't talk about the Bible one time. We talked about life. And he personally did my ceremony inviting me into the church. And that is when Christ really began to work on me. It was the combination of 9/11 and the combination of this beautifully, wonderfully spiritual priest. And as I went through that year, I began to know that there was a different path for me to take. I stayed 2 more years at Delta because it was a family, and I wanted to leave, as someone was saying, it was Mark Lenz and I last night, I wanted to leave on good terms. I wanted to leave my family feeling good about my departure. And the long and short of it is I went to work for the mayor of Atlanta for a year. She invited me to help her for a few hours a week, which ended up being about 70 hours a week. And I bought that, which shows you how smart I really am. At any rate, she took it upon herself to go and visit every graduating class in the city of Atlanta to talk to seniors about the importance of education. Now, education did not report to her, but the graduation rate was below, it was in the high 40s, somewhere like 45%. And she wanted these kids to know the importance of graduation, getting a job, going on with their lives. And so she said, "You're going with me." So we would go and visit these kids. She would give them her cell phone number and say, "Call me, I will write you a letter of recommendation. I will help you get into college," so forth and so on. And then we'd get in her car and she'd say, "You take all these calls." And I'm telling you, these kids, this was the inner city of Atlanta, they were calling in droves. And she gave them, this is no joke, her cell phone number and her credit card and wrote letters of recommendation. And before I forget, 92% of the kids graduated that year from the public schools in Atlanta. 92%, which is amazing, amazing. And I remember sitting in the back seat of her car and I said, "You know, what are you doing? And why are you doing this?" And she said, "Because I believe in the power of what one person can do, whether it's the mayor of Atlanta, chief marketing officer of Delta Airlines, a graduating senior from the Atlanta public school system. And when are you going to take what I think are some really powerful business skills and put them to good use?" And it was like the voice of God finally got through this thick head of mine, genuinely. And it took my breath away. And then she said another thing, which has been said over the course of these few days. And she said, "You know, Vicki, how much money is enough money?" And I stopped everything I was doing genuinely from that day forward and started looking for jobs where I could serve people and looking for jobs where I could serve especially people living in poverty, because I believe that's my calling. And so I'll wrap this up by saying I've had the unbelievably great fortune of leading wonderful groups of people at Feeding America. We worked on providing food security for over 30 million Americans living right at the poverty line. Half are children. A quarter were senior citizens who lost most of their income during the economic downturn, and the other quarter were families that were struggling just to make ends meet. And I fell in love with being with them, with holding them, with connecting with them. And I felt the power of Christ in my life every time I would go into a home. I remember, and I know I need to move this along here, but I remember going into the home of a veteran in Orlando, Florida, who had been one of our clients. And he was living in a very bad part of the town, of the city. And he had said he didn't want to talk to anybody. And we went into his home, the head of our operation in Orlando. And he lived at the top of this apartment. and the door was open. We walked in, and he was sitting there watching TV, and we started talking to him and walked into his kitchen, and there was nothing in the cupboard of his kitchen but a can of cat food and a bottle of water in the refrigerator. And we said, you know, John, how long has it been since you've had something to eat? And he said, it's been over a week. And so it was a wonderful way of, I don't know, redeeming myself and my life and connecting and all that you all know. And so when I got the phone call, and I'm looking at you, BJ, about opportunity from Doris Christopher, who's one of our advisors, about joining Opportunity. She said, I know this great organization, and would you consider interviewing? And I said, no. And she said, well, I'm going to pray about it. And so I said, and you guys are going to laugh, I think. I said, well, you pray, but I'm not praying. Because I like what I'm doing, and we're doing some really good work. And she said, well, I'm going to pray anyhow. She called me the next week, and then I went to an event with Linda Vanderweel. Where's Linda? I loved her. She was thinking, it's another nonprofit, get her out of here. And with David Sims. And then I met Mark Thompson and BJ, and Dave Tomey, and Ted Mosier, and they were part of the group that were interviewing me. And so I had the good fortune of being selected for this role. Now, why is all this important in my walk and in my faith and in my testimony? So I'll close by two things. 2 years ago, I walked into this place not really knowing what to expect. I had no idea. I mean, I kind of had an idea that it was really complicated and really kind of messy. I had been to Ghana, I had seen the work, I'd fallen one more time in love with clients that felt a lot like who I am at the core. And I thought, you know, we're going to do great work. We are going to help transform their lives. And guess what's happened? My whole life has been transformed. By all of you, individually and collectively, by the staff, by the donors, by the clients. I have been transformed, and that's what happens. And so I would end by saying, I humbly would present to you that I do feel that God has called me to this position for this time. And I feel all the experiences that I've had throughout all of my life have helped bring me here. And I'm honored to serve all of you. Thank you.